So thank you for joining us today, Sergio. Am I saying your name right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Great.
correct.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So can you tell me a little bit about your connection to the film and how did it all started?
Sure. First off, thanks, Lily, for this interview. I really appreciate it, and we also really appreciate being welcomed to your festival. It's an honor, and it's great to get the film to a more diverse and unique festivals. I think really help to spread the ethos and the missions of a lot of films that we work on as social documentary films. So, I mean, I'm the producer of the film. So a lot of times I have a community of filmmakers that I work with. And the director of this film approached me, Ariel Nasser, and he told me about his father's country, which is Afghanistan. And he had spent time there, and he told me a really fascinating story about how there is a real strong, vibrant group of filmmakers that have struggled through the years, and they're completely, profoundly passionate about their craft, and they've continued to make films under extremely dire situations, but they had also been making films under less dire situations. And so he was talking about an archive that had been under attack and was continuing to be under attack from extremists, but also from just neglect and decay. And I thought it was a fascinating story and would make a riveting documentary. And we were able to raise funds fairly soon after we put forward proposals, and so within a couple months we were actually in Afghanistan collecting more material to start the project. It still took a couple more years to get into production, but the idea was a strong one from the start, and we're really happy with it. And the Film Board of Canada came on board and as a co-producer and supported the project as well.
Oh, I'm really glad that the story has been told. So personally, I love the film. I would say this is one of my favorite films so far out of all the ones we've screened. And I find that it's just such a moving representation of culture and of history and the role that film can play in that. And I experienced a lot of emotional ups and downs when I was watching it. So I thought it was really, really well made. And I certainly learned something new. So thank you for telling that story. So my first question. So this question was brought up by actually another director who has watched the film. So in the movie, it's been described like the feeling of entering that archive and realizing that the films have been preserved. So that's been described a little bit, but we would like to hear a bit about your feelings when you first learned about it and you first saw all these films have been preserved.
For sure. I mean, because I had been told a little bit about it by the director who had been there before. And so I started to get a bit of a picture of it, but I didn't know the extent. I mean, part of the experience in the raw sensation of that is based on the fact that, when you have to go to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is, as we know, in this world of conflict. It's highly polarized world, and there's a lot of there's poverty, there's all the usual things that we associate with Afghanistan as it's going through war, and of course Canada's played its own part in that. So that was very much my first reaction, was seeing this country, arriving into Kabul and discovering the country. And then it was the idea that, shortly thereafter, we went to the Afghan film organization, the Afghan Film Institute, which basically houses these archives. And it's an interesting process because you have to go through most of Kabul, but you arrive in what is called the Green Zone, which is one of those sort of fortified areas that is the Afghan Film Institute is right next to the presidential palace. So you have to get in through, and it's multiple security checks. And then there's, you know, dogs sniffing and gates you have to go through and bumpers everywhere. So, I mean, all of that creates a sort of a heightened sense, you know. And then when we arrived at the building, it's an old building and there's a lot of staff there, but most of them, of course, aren't paid much more than, subsistence wages, food to a large extent. Um, and they're really wonderfully warm people. And so that was my initial, was meeting these people that were very passionate about film and excited to see us and meet us and talk. Obviously there's language barriers, but there was clearly a passion for the craft. And then seeing the films, I mean, there's all these, rows upon rows of these rooms where you just have old film stock, film reels, like 35 and 16 millimeter film, and in various states of decay. And it's impressive to see, these vast libraries that they have. But it's also, you're like, okay, well, this is kind of in a precarious situation, and they had some rooms. They were trying to do some digitizing. In the end, we ended up trying to help them with that. We enlisted the National Film Board to do some help as well, and bringing some of the films to Canada and digitizing them, some of which you see in our film, but also some that were just, to help them for their films and their filmmaking. But it's a raw experience, and it's hard to take it out of the context of Afghanistan and the context that it's in. But it's when you get into the films that it really starts to become quite riveting, is because then you start to see another cultural perspective that we don't get to see, and that most Afghans don't get to see. I mean, it's a short lifespan in Afghanistan, so most of the young people there, they don't even know the history. They've been living through war their whole life, so they don't know these periods of life that were, prosperous, and there was culture and arts and liberated, liberated women, and there's like strong protagonists that are females in a lot of these films. They're not wearing burqas, and they're going around doing their things and talking about their love and their attractions to what it is. So it's that which was really enriching for us, to be able to see these glimpses, and that took a lot of time, because you have to dig in and open up the films and get access, and that took a lot of time to let them trust us and build a relationship and go from there.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned young people. That's one of my question is, how many of these films have been restored and are available to the public? And in terms of the younger audience, how are they receiving it?
Well, in Afghanistan, they don't have an internet access space. So the young people in Afghanistan, they haven't really had a chance to witness the films. We did do a couple screenings in Kabul before we launched the film. So we took it, but that was mainly to the cast and crew and some of their family members. And they were very receptive and very happy, and they awarded us an award of appreciation. So very positive on that front. The young people that see it in the festivals so far that when we go to, there's usually Afghan associations, and so then they bring a lot of their members to the films, to the screening of The Forbidden Reel. And they tend to be, again, quite shocked at seeing something that they had heard about but never had a chance to see, in terms of the films, because all the films are, of course, filmed by Afghan directors, and so they capture those moments of history. And so that is definitely what takes place. There is in terms of access, we're building a website that will feature some of the films, sort of a chronological interactive access, and we're going to be launching that soon. The films are still continuing to go through a restoration process. The films have actually moved from the Afghan Film Institute, and they've gone into the Presidential Palace, which has a bit more of an archive restoration process at work. So the work is starting to pick up. The idea is to bring it online. There is one site that does feature some, like an earlier collection of the archives called padma.org, and it's an Indian archive site that basically does host some of the Afghan film archives. Other than that, our website will be coming out, and it's theforbiddenreel.com, and it will have the interactive archives will be available there. Other than that, there's not a lot of access to these, and there's not a lot of access for people to see them. It's a complicated process,
Mm-hmm.
So the aim and the hope with our film is to be able to increase that and to increase the access that young people can have, and especially for Afghan nationals to be able to access the films, because it's a piece of their culture, it's a piece of their history.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. I look forward to those websites.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned that internet is, well, as we know, internet's not really accessible in Afghanistan. So would you say the initial audience for these websites are more outside of the country and for people who want to understand Afghanistan?
Yes, I think that Afghanistan, it's one of those. It's a young society because sadly, lifespan is short. So there's definitely a huge group of young Afghan nationals in Kabul and other cities that are very internet savvy. However, infrastructurally, it's very hard to be able to download anything to, so they have, the modern technology is able to make video, group chats and whatnot work, but it's still very spotty and not great. So watching stuff online is near impossible. It's possible, but it just doesn't, it's unsatisfactory experiences. So eventually that will pick up, but there's lots of ingenuity there, so I'm sure they're going to improve on that. I think the idea is that for us, our film is targeted to a broader audience, so it can work. The film is ultimately in its original language, it's in Dari. So if you don't speak English, you don't need to read anything. So it's great for Afghan citizens to watch. They don't need much of the subtitles at all. And it works internationally. So the idea for us is to sort of do a theatrical circuit, thanks to you guys. And then also to play on broadcasters, and we hope that we'll target it to certain areas. Sometimes international communities, like we were interested in working with, like the NATO group or whatever, to help sort of encourage a greater understanding of our involvement in these countries. When we hear back, the film is very much about Afghans talking about the conditions on the ground for themselves.
Awesome. So you've alluded to this, and there was a comment in the documentary about the image of Afghanistan being very monolithic and violence being a prominent representation of the country. So, and that it's important for Afghanistan to be seen as something more than that. So what role do you think these films can play in changing this narrative?
Well, I think they play a huge role, if not some of the, some of the biggest roles, because we have very little access to that, and I think that, it's not so much a fault of the media in terms of its portrayal of the country. It's just that the way that we consume news is that it's, if it bleeds, it leads, thematic, which is basically what's going to be on the front page and what's the headlines is the sort of the death toll. And for instance, one of the things that we don't know about, in North America, is that the leading cause of death is not even remotely related to terrorism. The leading cause of death in Afghanistan is giving childbirth. So women and children die based on the fact that there is just a lack of sanitary conditions and the fact that there's lack of access to medical, midwifery services and doctors. So, it's like those are kind of statistics that no one knows about. But based on, we all know about terrorism and war, and so, it's through the films that we make and that we dig in and we look deeper into some of these things, and we hear from, people in Afghanistan talking about the things that they like, that we go, oh, wait a second, Afghan women wore skirts and they, danced in national parades, and they, they were, interested in arts and culture, and they, there was fascination for life that we don't think about, we just think there's this level of oppression and there's this level of conflict that's there, and that's it, So, I think these films help, they play a part. Obviously, when you meet someone who is from Afghanistan, that's a great opportunity to learn something, as it is in any country. If you meet someone from another country, then you get a stronger sense, you have a personalized moment. Not everyone has those opportunities. So, films play a part. And for us, and for me in particular, long form documentary is a chance to build a stronger narrative, to build a stronger argument that says, hey, the world is way more sophisticated than we think, and it's actually complex and in wonderful ways, and that was what we were hoping to do with the film, and to be able to show this vibrant cultural community that was surviving through the thick of it and would continue to survive. And and so I think we're hoping it plays a part, but it's we're all part of that. Your festival is part of that. It's how we create discussion and dialogue and reflect, and then go, okay, do we want to support the Canadian troops? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. It's a chance for us to look at it and go, how does this work? And is there ways we can support indigenous activities in Afghanistan or in other parts of the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very good perspective. So we had a question, and being not filmmakers, we wanted to hear your opinion about this.
Sure.
So in the film, it's mentioned that at one point there was two types of filmmakers. So there was the ones who are not affiliated with the Soviets. So especially during the Soviet era. So you have the propaganda films, and then you have the other films. So do you think the propaganda films have any less value or more value than non-affiliated films in telling the history and the culture of the country?
Good question. Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're looking back at Afghanistan, but it doesn't. You don't have to look back at Canada to know that the National Film Board of Canada was considered to be the Ministry of Propaganda. In the early days, propaganda was not considered to be a negative construct as it is today. And of course, that negativity was increased through the idea that governments could do bad things by persuading their citizens to take up arms, for instance, against an unjust cause. So the whole Nazi regime sort of contributed to this idea that propaganda is evil. But we've pushed that envelope all the way as far as it can go, and we're starting to reflect a little bit more. And countries today are still put forward propaganda, and in some cases it's necessary. I mean, the government right now is
Mhm.
putting forward all kinds of messaging about COVID-19 and how we should do vaccinations. And I mean, it's our government propaganda. No one's going to call it propaganda, but that's entirely what it is. So, um, and the other thing is to keep in mind is that during that time period, it was considered propaganda per se, but from the filmmaker's perspective, they just needed access to the resources to make films. And so for them, they had to do something that would, encourage the government bodies to fund their films. So they would take themes that they think the government would be supportive of. But to a large extent, they still had a lot of autonomy to make some of those films. I mean, obviously, if they made the film and the government didn't like it, then there would be some blowback and challenges, and maybe they wouldn't release the film, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
However, it's not entirely unlike our system either. I mean, I have to get a lot of taxpayer support to make my films, and there's a lot of
Mhm.
funding that is attached to public bodies, and I think that's great. However, it has to be of a national interest. So this film in particular is an interesting example because it doesn't have a lot of Canadian thematics running through it, but it's a lot of Canadian support to make it. And I think it's great that we made it. But nonetheless, when I try to get resources for the films I want to make, they have to also reflect something that the broader Canadian public would participate in. Very much like in those days when they were making films, it was like, why would the communist government support a film that would go against their interests in building this new country that they claim as a new country for themselves? So I think that during those times, the filmmakers were quite clever in being able to work with. They were like, this is a funding body. And this is the rules that they're putting up. This is the constraints. But ultimately, the bigger challenges were like, they still didn't have the resources. So they had a style of filmmaking that was like, I'm going to use my friends here and these people, and this community, we're going to come together. We're going to shoot a real type of event with the backdrop that is going on. For instance, there's a strike outside. They're going to use that as part of the story. We're going to go somewhere and we're going to film this, but we have to work with the local tribes people. And then so there's all kinds of environmental circumstances that they have to incorporate, which in essence told historical telling of what was going on. And I mean, even one of our principal characters, Engineer Latif, who was, one of the pioneers at that time and working directly with the government, and endorsed by the government. He made films they didn't endorse. He made films that they banned. And he was their appointed, head of the Afghan films. And his films hold up today as a testament of what was going on during that time. And that was all under the censorship of the propaganda board, as it was. But for him, he doesn't see it as propaganda, and he didn't feel it as propaganda. I mean, clearly there are some more propaganda films that we don't show in ours, and there's definitely some less propagandic films. But they were fiction films, and the audiences wanted them, and the audiences loved them, and they had strong themes. Themes of abuse or love affair or forbidden love, and revolt, rebellion, running away, trying to escape. There's a great film called Escape, and it's just about like the upper class of Kabul trying to get out during the siege. And of course the communist government at the time, they totally didn't like it. But it's a profound film about what everyone was doing, and wanting to run away. And it was a testament to the fact that the government was failing, you know.
Mhm.
But that's the ingenuity of filmmakers, being able to still make the films that they need to make, and tell the truth to the public.
Mhm. Very, very cool. Very romantic nation.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's a bit of that.
So you mentioned that, I mean, obviously Afghan film is based in Kabul, and a lot of the filming is based in the city. Do you think these films accurately represent the entire country, or is it selective because of that limitation?
Very good point. Yes, it is. It is a much more representative, of the large urban centers, and even I would just go to say it's probably more concentrated as Kabul. There's other other large cities that Jalalabad and like Kandahar, that there's similarities, but they didn't have, they weren't, didn't have a film community, and so they have, it was harder for them to make films that were as representative, and so yes, it's, even during the early periods, there is some elements of the way of life that is represented in some of these films, because they went out and captured these things, but that's part of the nature of it. I mean, whether it was here in Canada, I think we struggled to get equal representation of the provinces, and in the north, there's a lot less of that, and we're still going through a reckoning of our own in terms of like, allowing more Indigenous filmmakers to represent their own culture, rather than having people from the city and the urban areas go somewhere and then capture it and bring it back and talk about it as the true life. So in those same sense, they struggle with the same things, but that's the thing. I mean, some of the main characters are people talking about, in essence, sometimes bourgeoisie things, like, oh, should I marry this poor artist versus this rich guy who I'm bored with? It's not necessarily the someone in a village is contemplating their life, but over the years, there has been strong films that have come out, like one of the people we talk about, is one of the filmmakers is a filmmaker who made the film Osama, which is probably the most well-known film, and it's a beautiful film that was shot for under $10,000 US. And it's basically a portrait, and it was shot in Kabul right after the war, and it's a portrait of a young girl who's has to shave her head to to hide during the Taliban, and it's a harrowing story, and but it's a beautiful film, and it's very much a portrait of the context of what was going on in the rural world, and just the valuation of life at the time and the conditions of young women and older women, and so I think on the whole, there still was a passion to tell the greater Afghanistan story from these filmmakers, but sometimes some of those things didn't, they definitely weren't represented in all the films, but I think we get that picture. We start to see it more, and that was one of the things that we wanted to do, was show the diversity of filmmaking, the diversity of things that were coming out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, it's really great to see. I wasn't very shocked, but I remember the first time I saw pictures from Iran from the 70s, I was very shocked. And it's kind of the same idea that it was once very open. It was a very different country, right, with very different images. So I think it's definitely have an effect. So do you think today's government, Afghan government, are they supportive of filmmaking? Are films still being made today?
They are very supportive of filmmaking. I mean, the current president, Mr. Ghani, he's very supportive. I mean, his daughter is featured in our film, and so he's of course taken in the archive as a way of trying to like increase that, and they've been involved in they've put in a new director who's a young filmmaker, who's very talented. She's done a number of films. Sergeo Kirby is her name, and she's now runs the Afghan Film Organization, and she shows a lot of promise. She's planning to make a feature film at Afghan Films for the first time in a long time, so that's really exciting. And they've divided up they've distributed the roles so that the Afghan film organization is going to do production, and then the films are going to be part of Afghan Film Archives, which is a separate organization, so that there's less sort of a blend between it and they can be better organized. And I think there shows a lot of promise there. I mean, it's really hard to tell though. I mean, you've got some really talented young women that are involved in news organizations and media, but they're also under attack. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Right now, it is the most violent time period that it's ever been in Afghanistan. Since the start of the war, there's more casualties than before. So, nothing is getting easier. Everything's getting worse. And then you have the threat of, the Americans pulling out, and you have, some sort of heightened conflict in terms of the negotiation process. So, something has to give for it to get better in some way. And sadly, what has now become a bit of an issue is that young journalists and media people are being targeted. And so I am worried about the people that I know there. I'm worried about the people I don't know who are involved in media and doing really excellent work. Because right now it's deadly. So it has not gotten better. And even though there's support from the government, they just don't have, they can't provide security. So for them to provide support in any, they don't have the ability to do that. So they've got their hands full. So it's more about what I'm inspired by is just the ingenuity, the passion, the determination, and the talent, frankly, from some of these young filmmakers of Afghan nationals.
Mm-hmm. So given this context, do you think it's still safe to keep these archives within Afghanistan?
Well, that was part of our reasoning was to be able to encapsulate what was in those archives. That was part of the argument for us to take some of the films and digitize them, but then send them back so that there's a broader access. I mean, that's part of the reasoning for digitizing as much as they possibly can, because then it's easy for them to make duplicates, to make copies, so that then the films will be, ideally preserved in potentially different locations. Having mirrored copies, all of that. I mean, digitization in and of itself is not an ideal form of archive. It has all kinds of problems. I mean, a book lasts 1,000 years, a film lasts 100 years, and a hard drive around 25. So, so basically, this idea that somehow this cutting edge technology is going to save us forever is actually totally backwards. I mean, if anything, we should write in books what is in the films, and then they'd be preserved forever. But technology is very short period. I mean, most of the long-term digitizing is a vastly expensive process, and then it goes extinct after a certain period, and then you have to redigitize it. When you actually want to do when you want to archive films, the best process is to digitize it and then print it back onto 35 millimeter prints, and then put that away, and it'll last way longer than the digital side. And that's what a lot of archivists want to do, but they can't pay for it that way, But if they did, it would probably save them money in the long run, because the amount of costs you have to go through every time you go through another 5 to 25 years, you have to replace all your hard drives.
Interesting, like definitely something we don't know, being not from the filmmaking industry. So bringing the concept back to the Canadian context. Mm-hmm. So as Canadians, you've kind of mentioned this, but as Canadians, do you think we're doing a good job in terms of preserving our culture and history and through film? And protecting our film industry? And is there anything more we can do?
Well, this is definitely a shout out to my partners, the National Film Board of Canada. I grew up on watching films, the National Film Board, and it was a major instigation in the role that I play now as a documentary filmmaker. So I would say some of the, even if they weren't the greatest films that I watched as a child, they formed who I am, and they played a part in making me want to make films. One of the early films that I watched, Manufacturing Consent, which blew me away, which was a National Film Board of Canada film. As a young man, I saw that and I was like, that's what I want to do. So I think we've done an excellent job. I think if anything, there's been a push within the documentary community to sort of create that there should be a national art form, and the national art form, which we feel very passionate about, should be documentary film. I think it's one of the things that we excel at and we're renowned for internationally. So also a shout out to, I think, the institutions of Canada during COVID. They've been very supportive of the artists and the filmmakers, and they've helped a lot of us stay afloat. So the Canada Council for the Arts, this Canadian Media Fund and Telefilm Canada, they all supported their creators in different ways. It was a struggle to equitably make it happen, but they did it. To lesser, some success, some less success, clearly, but most of us were able to survive. So I think there's always room for improvement. There's a current struggle to look at representation, which I think is important, and we need to continue that discussion in terms of like more representation on film, more representation behind the camera, and more representation at the governing bodies that decide which films are being funded. So those are all key. The film board has probably one of the largest archives, if not the largest archive one of the largest archives in the world. And they are, they got the support to continue to create that archive. So I'm optimistic that there's still room for them to build that, but I'm positive that we will have a good history intact, an archive that is going to represent the evolution of the last 100 years of our country in a very accurate way. There's always room for more, but I think that the people in charge, and I've worked with a lot of them, and this is mainly the National Film Board of Canada, are doing great work, in that, and they're very passionate about it, and they participated in this film in supporting Afghan nationals doing the same thing. So I think if they can find ways to get more resources, all the better.
Mm-hmm. So a last question. If the members of the public, or especially younger people, if they want to get involved in this filmmaking process and they're not necessarily coming from a filmmaking background, how can they get involved?
Well, they can do. If they're trying to get involved as filmmakers or get involved as like supporting the causes that are in the films.
I guess both.
Well, in terms of filmmaking, there's always, it's just you have to show your creativity in whatever way and fashion you can, So it's like if you you don't have to be a camera person per se, but you want to express an idea, long form filmmaking is an art that is based on building a narrative and telling a story that is sustainable, and in essence, your documentary is just like it has the same rules and ideas around fiction filmmaking. So that it's basically just continue to express yourself, and then you have to show your friends and other people, and eventually that'll lead you to someone who's going to want to help you build that. And filmmaking is a team effort. So part of it is being able to work with other people, and that is a key component. And in terms of support within the film on the themes of the subjects that we work on, I mean, reaching out a lot of times to the directors, the producers of the film. Sometimes it's also just like, once you see that, it's like, reaching out to people that are in your community that you think are related to the topics. If there's usually an association across Canada for one or two of the themes that are usually represented in all the films that we make. So, in our film, just reaching out to the Afghan communities, or someone who who's from the Afghan diaspora, or even some of the neighboring countries. I mean, or if you're interested in archives, every country has some form of archive. It's that's kind of like a fascinating topic. There's lots of room to build and grow there. So so I think that's, it's like, go where your interests want to take you, and just ask around. And it's always fun to do it in a personal level too. Film is a particular medium, but what is exciting is, for me, is, the making is one part, but I love meeting people and talking to them and going places and meeting more people. And so as an audience, that's what you would want as well.
Well, thank you for all these ideas. Definitely very inspiring.
Nice.
Thank you for your time. And this brings us to the end of film. We'll provide maybe your contact information or your company's contact information. And then if anyone's interested, they can contact you for more information.
Thank you, Lily. It's been great. And good luck with the screenings. And I hope to hear more.
Okay, thank you. I would like to take this time to thank you again for supporting the Marda Justice Film Festival. Our festival could not have survived without your continuous support. If you enjoy what you saw today, please consider making a small donation. We are a nonprofit festival and rely on the generosities of our supporters to keep the festival free of charge and accessible. The donation link can be found on the CERB TV film subscription page or on our festival's website, justicefilmfestival.ca.